Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you again for our weekly update. We thought we'd jump right in today, start off with an issue that has been, I think, at the top of mind for a lot of people. We're getting a lot of questions about this, and it relates to the travel advisory issued by New York State. We're going to have two presenters on that today, Teresa Rusnick, who helped us unpack it last week, and Subha Viswanathan. So take it away, guys.
Thank you, Pete. So I am going to be talking about the travel restrictions and where we have been to kind of recap where we were last week, some of the guidance and executive orders that came out. I'm then going to turn it over to Subha to talk about where we are in terms of the most recent guidance that came out on the night of July 2nd, which some of you may not have even had a chance to thoroughly digest yet, given the holiday weekend. So where we have been, as everyone is aware of by now, we had Executive Order 205 that came out on June 24th. That was the executive order that stated for the first time that individuals who travel to restricted states were subject to a 14-day mandatory quarantine when they return. The executive order is quite short. It basically says that the 14-day quarantine is applicable to all individuals except when exceptions are made by the Department of Health, and we're going to talk about the exceptions the Department of Health has made in a minute. But the executive order also imposes penalties, and that's where we see that if you are an individual who travels to a restricted state and who does not quarantine appropriately when they come back, they could be subject to a penalty of up to $10,000 levied by New York State. So that's Executive Order 205. It's pretty short. One thing I'll mention when I'm talking about that is the restricted states themselves. Those are not listed in the executive order. They are listed in a web page put out by the Department of Health. Initially, we thought that was going to be updated weekly per the Department of Health's original information on that. We've seen that it's been updated much more frequently than that. In fact, it was just updated again. In addition to the 16 states we had last week when we did this webinar, we now have the addition of Delaware, Kansas, and Oklahoma. For those of you that are keeping track, we are rapidly approaching the 50% mark of states that New Yorkers cannot travel to and not quarantine when they get back, or states that travelers can't come from and not quarantine when they reach New York. So that list is ever expanding. Importantly, we haven't seen anyone taken off the list. We've just seen additions for different states. And with the virus continuing to grow in different parts of the country, again, I expect that we'll be at that 50% mark by the time we speak again next week. So that's the list that's available online for anyone to look at. And again, it is updated more frequently than weekly. Then, coming off of the executive order, the Department of Health released guidance on Executive Order 205. As I said, Executive Order 205 is quite short. It doesn't have a lot of specifics in it. So for that, we turn to the Department of Health guidance. They released it also on June 24th, so about the same time as the executive order came out. And it gives us a number of points to clarify, and then creates a number of muddy points as well. And I'm going to let Subha talk more about those. But some of the things the guidance does tell us is if you're an individual who needs to quarantine, how you're supposed to quarantine in terms of where you're supposed to live, what you're not supposed to do, how your food and garbage are supposed to be managed, what's to happen if you develop symptoms, etc. So all of that guidance is in the DOH's publication from June 24th. There's also clarification that the 14-day quarantine period applies when we're talking about employers to all non-essential employees. The guidance sets forth an exception for people, travelers, employees, etc., who are in states that are on the restricted list for less than 24 hours. For those that are just passing through the states, they're not subject to the 14-day quarantine, so that's where we get that exception from. And then the DOH guidance from June 24th sets forth these short, medium, and long-term guidelines, which are applicable to employees traveling to New York if they're essential employees, and that's based on the amount of time the employee is intending to spend in New York, and it ranges from fewer than 12 hours to over 36 hours, depending on whether you're following the short, medium, or long-term guidance, and there's different requirements within each of those subsets as well. The DOH guidance from June 24th does remind employers to follow industry-specific guidance if that applies to you, and they give the example of nursing homes. They're not the only ones that have industry-specific guidance, but they are the example that the Department of Health uses. So employers, please just be aware that even though there is guidance that's more recent, it's not necessarily guidance that supersedes, and it in fact explicitly says you need to continue to follow the guidance specific for your industry. I think the most contested, or one of the most contested questions we got in the wake of Executive Order 205 and the DOH guidance from June 24th is how that guidance applies to essential employees and whether or not Executive Order 205 applies to essential employees. There was, as we discussed last week, at least a colorable argument that essential employees were not subject to the 14-day quarantine based on the language of the DOH guidance. That's something that Sue was going to talk more about in light of the FAQs that the Department of Health published a couple of days ago. But that's where we were with the DOH guidance on June 24th. Then on June 26th, we got Executive Order 202.45. That is the one that said that if individuals voluntarily travel to a restricted state, and that's based on the state's status at the time the individual returns to New York, that they are not entitled to New York State COVID-19 sick leave for that quarantine period. So if you remember, back in March, New York State had published different types of COVID-19 sick leave for employees, and that was based on the size and type of employer. So this executive order says if you as an employee voluntarily go to one of those restricted travel areas, you are not eligible for New York COVID-19 leave when you come back. Now that's different if the person's compelled to go there by their employer, but if they voluntarily go there and it's on the list of restricted states, they do not get the New York State COVID-19 leave when they come back. Given the original language of the statute regarding restricted travel areas, if you remember, it was originally targeted toward international travel back when the law was written. Now, it's a little unclear whether or not the notice requirement that was applicable to the international travel is also applicable to domestic travel. To be on the safe side, it's never a bad idea to inform your employees explicitly that if they travel to any of the destinations on the restricted travel list, that they're not going to be able to get New York COVID-19 leave when they come back. One of the other important pieces to this is whether or not Executive Order 202.45 and 205, the quarantine executive order, impact an employee's ability to have federal leave under the Families First Coronavirus Act. So one of the tenets of federal leave for emergency paid sick leave is that an individual gets it if they're subject to an order of quarantine by the federal, state, or local government. And we had some discussion last week about whether or not Executive Order 205 qualifies as an order of quarantine issued by a state sufficient to trigger the emergency paid sick leave. There are some arguments on either side of that analysis, but that's just something we want you to be aware of, that it is at least possible, if not likely, that if you have an employee who is subject to this 14-day quarantine period, their emergency paid sick leave could be triggered if they're a covered employee of a covered entity under the federal law. So with that, that's where we've been. I'm going to turn it over to Suba to talk about where we are in the most recent DOH FAQs from July 2nd.
Thanks, Teresa. So as Teresa said, the night of July 2nd, just in time for the holiday weekend, the Department of Health issued an FAQ document regarding the travel quarantine restrictions. There's some information in there that's kind of confirms what we already knew. Some information is new, so I'm going to kind of do my best to summarize those FAQs and kind of describe the information that we have based on the FAQs that we didn't have before. And I'm sure a lot of you are trying to digest this as well. So I will do my best to summarize. So some of the information in the FAQs reiterates earlier information. So we know the 9 requirements to safely quarantine. That's the same as what was in the June 24th guidance. We know that the quarantine restrictions are not applicable for someone who spends less than 24 hours in a restricted state. One of the FAQs addresses a question of whether a traveler can come out of quarantine if they return to New York and test negative. And the answer to that in the FAQs is no. And the DOH's reasoning on that is because symptoms of COVID-19 could potentially still appear for up to 14 days. So if an individual travels, comes back, gets a COVID-19 test, comes back negative, that person is still required to complete the full 14 days in quarantine. There is some more guidance in the FAQs on the application of the travel quarantine restrictions to essential workers. One thing I think has been clarified is that those essential worker exceptions apply not just to essential workers who reside elsewhere, who come into New York State to do work. It also applies to New York State residents who travel elsewhere and then return to New York. In one portion of the FAQs, it specifically says if you are returning from travel to a designated state, so it uses that phrase, returning from travel to a designated state, and the travel was for 24 hours or longer, the person's required to quarantine for 14 days unless you are an essential worker or fall under another exception as determined by the Commissioner of Health. So I think that question and answer kind of clarifies that issue of whether a New York State resident who's an essential worker goes on vacation to Florida, comes back, whether that is an exception to the 14-day quarantine, and it seems to be. Essential workers are defined in the FAQs as any individual employed by an entity that's on the Empire State Development Essential Business List, or any individual who's employed as a healthcare worker, first responder, or in any position within a nursing home, long-term care facility, or other congregate care setting. So that's the definition of essential worker. The FAQs seem to break it down further into what restrictions are applicable to healthcare workers, what restrictions are applicable to essential workers who have been exposed to someone with a COVID-19 positive test, and all other essential workers. So let's kind of talk about each of those. So in answer to the question, how does the travel restriction affect healthcare personnel? DOH actually begins the response by saying anyone who's traveled to a designated state will be required to quarantine when entering New York State for 14 days from the last day in a designated state. So there's kind of this presumption that the person has to quarantine. But the DOH carves out an exception, allowing healthcare entities to allow healthcare personnel to work if all of the following conditions are met. So the first condition is that furloughing the healthcare employee would result in staff shortages that would adversely impact the operation of the healthcare entity, and all other staffing options have been exhausted. So if you are a healthcare entity and you have a healthcare worker who's traveled for vacation or something elsewhere to one of the restricted states and then returns to New York, you have to go through that analysis as to whether furloughing that employee, or essentially allowing that person to stay out on the 14-day quarantine, would result in staff shortages. And you got to look at what other staffing options you might have to fill that void, whether it's a temp agency, per diems, some other way to fill that void. If after that analysis, you decide that we can't have that person be out for 14 days, it would adversely impact the operation of the healthcare entity, then you can make an exception to that person having to quarantine for 14 days. The other conditions that have to be met are the employee has to be asymptomatic. The employee has to have received diagnostic testing for COVID-19 within 24 hours of arrival in New York. The employee has to self-monitor twice a day for fever and other symptoms, and has to receive temperature monitoring and symptom checks at the beginning of each shift and at least every 12 hours during a shift. The employee has to wear a face mask while working. I think that's probably something that healthcare entities would require anyway. To the extent possible, the employee should be assigned to patients at lower risk for severe complications from COVID-19. It does say to the extent possible. So again, I think you need to go through that analysis of whether, if you decide that it's going to adversely impact your entity, and you bring that person back, and there's the potential to assign that person to perhaps younger patients, patients who don't have immune deficiencies, those that wouldn't be at higher risk for COVID-19, you should, to the greatest extent possible, make those assignments. The employee has to self-quarantine when not at work, and the employee has to stop working and isolate at home if any symptoms develop. So that's healthcare workers. Essential workers who return to work after COVID-19 exposure are required to follow DOH guidance that was issued on May 31st. So if an employee who's determined to be an essential worker has had close or proximate contact with a person with COVID-19 for a prolonged period of time and is not experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. So the person has to be asymptomatic. The essential worker can return under the following conditions. So the first of all, there has to be a determination, a documented determination by the supervisor and HR in conjunction with state and local health authorities that the employee truly is essential and is critical for the operation or safety of the workplace. So if that determination is made, the person can return, but the employee has to self-monitor for a temperature greater than or equal to 100 degrees every 12 hours. The employee has to wear a face mask. The employee has to continue social distancing. The employer has to clean and disinfect workspaces regularly, and the employee has to quarantine when not in the workplace for 14 days after exposure. So if the essential worker isn't a healthcare worker, hasn't actually been exposed to someone with COVID-19, then we're under the short-term, medium-term, or long-term requirements that Teresa described that were in the June 24th guidance that are reiterated in the July 2nd FAQs. And our best reading of this is that if someone who is a New York State resident travels to one of the restricted states and then returns back to New York State, that person would be under the long-term requirements. So it would essentially be considered a long-term stay, and that person would have to follow the requirements for a long-term stay, which essentially are the worker has to seek diagnostic testing. Actually, the way it's phrased is the employee should seek diagnostic testing for COVID-19 as soon as possible upon arrival within 24 hours to ensure they're not positive. So it does say should, which makes it seem like it's more of a recommendation than a requirement. But either way, our advice is to do what you can to make sure that the employee complies with that requirement. The essential worker should monitor temperature and signs of symptoms, should wear a face covering in public, should maintain social distancing, and the employer, again, should clean and disinfect workspaces for a minimum of 14 days. Essential workers also, to the extent possible, unless required for the essential work, are required to avoid extended periods in public contact with strangers and large congregate settings for a period of at least 14 days. So this might go without saying, but unless an employee falls within one of those exceptions, healthcare worker, essential worker, if it's a non-essential worker, that person has to quarantine for 14 days upon returning to New York from a restricted state. So the last thing I want to address is penalties. So the wording of the executive order and the FAQs reiterate that there's a potential $10,000 fine to an individual who doesn't follow the quarantine restrictions. There doesn't seem to be an explicit penalty for an employer who possibly misadvises an employee or requires an employee to come to work in violation of the quarantine restrictions. But again, it wouldn't shock any of us if there were a penalty, if that $10,000 penalty were imposed by the DOH under certain circumstances. My view of it is if the employer acts in good faith, tries to make sure that employees follow the FAQs and the guidance to the greatest extent possible. It seems unlikely that a misinterpretation of the guidance would result in a penalty. But again, that the employer should certainly act in good faith, because if the employer does require an employee to return to work in violation of quarantine restriction and the employee is clearly non-essential, it wouldn't shock me if there was some sort of penalty, perhaps the 10,000, perhaps something else associated with that bad faith conduct. So Pete, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Suba. We had quite a few questions. One of the questions I answered in the chat, people are looking for a link to the FAQs. I sent that out to everybody, so check your chat function and you'll have the link there. Let me also just take a quick stab, Suba, before you go back on mute, to summarizing this. So I think the best way to summarize this is to say that the quarantine order applies to everyone. And then we look at essential workers being potentially accepted for various situations. The sort of general exception for essential workers, an exception for essential workers who may have been exposed, and then a slightly different exception for healthcare workers. And you have to work your way through the various permutations. We have a lot of specific questions in the chat, in the Q&A about very specific situations, and you're just going to have to work through these on a case-by-case basis. We don't have time to answer every single permutation here, but we're happy to work through those with you as they arise. And I also think, last thing before I throw it back to you, Suba, for a few quick comments, if you have any, this is evolving. Like we've seen with every other executive order and guidance that, the order comes out, the guidance comes out, and then some supplemental guidance comes out. This may evolve further. But as to this point, this is kind of the best intelligence that we're able to gather on it. Anything else, Suba, you want to add to that before we move on?
No, I think that was a good summary, Pete.
Okay, let's move on to Hermes Fernandez. Hermes is now with us. We had a little technical difficulties, a little excitement on our end that none of you had the ability to experience, but it looks like he's here and connected, and so he's got some thoughts on things that are going on in Albany, our weekly feature. Go ahead, Hermes.
Thanks, Pete. Yes, as Pete said, there was a little excitement, but here I am. And actually, if I could add one comment to what you just talked about in terms of these new guidance regarding quarantine and travel outside the state, it is this. These are very complicated rules, and this is one of those circumstances. I know when I give any advice, and we spent the better part of the last couple of days trying to work through these, you need the rules in front of you. Don't do this from memory. Right? This one's a hard one. You've got to step-by-step check off, go down the list. Even with working with your attorney, you've got to go through the list. So I've been asked to talk about where we are, or where Albany is at this point. And where Albany is where the governor is, right? Because we still now, in July, are working with the governor, having been granted extraordinary powers on March 2nd, which allows him to rule by decree. We were just talking about the executive orders. We're now up to Executive Order 202.48. So we've got 48 executive orders. And these are not 1 or 2 line executive orders. They are very lengthy. And what we are seeing from the governor I can best summarize this way. Back in March, as this crisis was building in New York, and New York still has borne more of the brunt of this than any other state in the nation other than New Jersey. The numbers in New Jersey are proportionate to those in New York. The governor announced New York pause, right? And New York pause was the shutting of businesses, the shutting of schools, what we're still living with. And as we got through March and through April and began the reopening of New York, which we've talked about in phases, right? Phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 in various parts of the state are in various phases. Let's go to my one slide here. This is where we are now in phases. All of New York, except Long Island and New York City, are in phase 4, which means we've gone through all the phases of reopening. Long Island and New York City remain in phase 3. Long Island is scheduled, I believe, to begin phase 4 tomorrow. New York City to follow next week. So that's New York forward. But what we're seeing now is a governor who is hesitant, right? We are beginning to see New York pause reemerge. And the reason we're seeing that is what's happening in the rest of the country. I can't speak, from inside of the governor's brain, but I have paid close attention to the words the governor has used. And one of the things I've noticed in these 4 months is pay attention to what the governor says. When the governor has said, I intend to do this, but there may be changes, right? He's been very consistent about that. Pete just alluded to the fact that this is evolving. We're seeing changes. There are changes on a continuing basis. And what we have seen now with the events in other states, and the states that New Yorkers frequent, we're seeing high rates of new cases in California, Florida, North Carolina, Arizona. And those are some of the states now that are subject to the travel restrictions. What has happened in those states is giving the governor pause. California, because in California took steps earlier than New York did. And California took very significant steps. And the case numbers dropped significantly in California. In fact, for much of the last 2 months, there have been numbers of articles written and commentators on television and elsewhere and podcasts and things talking about why has California done so much better than New York? And there was discussion about, well, California acted sooner. Well, California's acted sooner across the board. California closed sooner, California reopened sooner. And we're seeing now a reemergence in California that has causing, I think it's caused a reevaluation. It's also caused a validation of the fact that if you move too quickly, if things, the very basic provisions that we've been dealing with of social distancing, mask wearing, are not followed, the virus reemerges, right? We saw in Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, numbers going up very, very quickly. States that were not as stringent about social distancing. We've seen now in California, and again, I believe California is driving the governor's view more than anything else. We are seeing the reemergence as these matters have been lifted, right? As these very basic provisions have been lifted. So where's the governor now? The governor is applying the brakes. We heard yesterday, the governor has decided not to allow the state fair to take place. We saw yesterday, and I guess I was reading it this morning, but it was issued overnight, his latest executive order. The latest executive order says that activities of public amusement will not be allowed to reopen for the present time, right? So that's amusement parks, gyms. The governor had already put the brakes on indoor dining in New York City, bowling alleys, malls, right? Remember just last week, it's always hard to remember how, because these things are moving so quickly, and last week seems distant. Malls are still not open. And the governor's been talking for the last few days about the need to find new means of filtering air. So what we're seeing is a slowdown, pausing. The other piece that I think is extremely interesting is schools, right? The governor has not yet said that schools will reopen in September. He is seems to be very concerned about indoor air filtration. The Board of Regents have not yet put out guidance documents for school districts to reopen. The health department has not put out guidance documents for school districts to reopen. School districts are required to be submitting plans to the State Board of Regents, to the State Department of Health in terms of how they will reopen, but they've not been given the guidance to follow yet, which puts us back to where other industries were, as other industries were putting together plans in terms of reopening, yet without having guidance. Their plans help to shape the guidance, so there's been a bit of a chicken and egg thing going through. But where we are is pausing. The other thing that's really notable now is enforcement. The governor has been, for most of the first 3 months that we've been through this, talking about the need for public adherence and talking about the fact that most of this is really dependent upon public acceptance. So is the public following the rules? We've seen in the last week, especially, the governor talking more about the fact that he is seeing lower levels of adherence. A part of that is confusion, that people begin to think phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 is a reopening of their own personal abilities as opposed to the opening of businesses and activities. But a part of it is simply, people are tired of it. I've seen it among myself, and I've seen it among my family. I've seen it among other people I know, right? We're seeing different levels of adherence almost by age group, and we're seeing different levels of adherence by geographic region of the state. So the governor, in the executive order he issued overnight, did something very interesting. The governor said repeatedly, I don't have enough state troopers, enough state police to enforce these rules. I need local governments to enforce. Well, we've seen some local government rebellion. We've seen some state sheriffs around the state saying, I will not enforce. We've seen some county executives around the state say, I will not enforce. So the executive order the governor issued last night now empowers peace officers to enforce the rules. And that is a significant expansion, right? We've got police officers and peace officers. Peace officers have some authorities, and now the governor's giving them a great deal more authority. And peace officers can be college security guards. Peace officers can be park rangers. Peace officers can be various public health officials. So the governor has essentially expanded the body of individuals who he can charge to enforce rules. And we've seen some enforcement even over the weekend. I know in the capital region where I live, at least 2 restaurants and bars had their liquor licenses revoked on the spot over this past 4th of July weekend for failing to follow the rules. I saw in Long Island, the same thing occurred. There was a number of East End establishments that had their liquor licenses pulled over the spot, on the spot, for their failures to enforce. So we're going to see more enforcement. So where Albany is right now is slowing the rate of opening. We are at phase 4.5 maybe, but that means delay. And then we're seeing enforcement. I'm not expecting to see many further changes, but those 2 pieces are extremely significant. And the governor's going to be watching very closely what's happening in other states. Pete, I can conclude.
Hermes, thanks. You said it before, and I guess it's really important to keep in mind that, for those of us who thought there was just 4 phases, there aren't. I mean, it's really an indeterminate number. So you say 4.5, and we just don't know, how many phases there might be. And, as we regress in some areas and progress in others, we're just going to have to be managing this for a while.
Right, we could be back to phase 3.5.
Yeah.
They go backwards.
And not every phase has been linear either. Some people who thought they'd be open in phase 4 aren't. So, okay, let's shift gears. Thanks, Hermes. Let's go to Chris Kurtz. Chris is going to give us a public sector update, both with respect to the most recent executive order developments there and some thoughts on the travel advisory as well. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me back. I was on a few weeks ago and we were addressing municipal work restrictions. And as we'll see as we come to pretty shortly here, for the most part, those are gone. And employees are returning to the public sector and the municipal workplace. But when I was getting ready for this, there was some, as Hermes was discussing, there was an executive order last night that was put out. And I was kind of thinking, a lot of times I deal with my clients, I say, look, this isn't the Olympics. We don't get points for degree of difficulty. And sometimes it feels like Albany may not necessarily follow that maxim, but I think it really speaks to what Hermes was saying with sort of the volatility and the fluctuation of these issues and how they can change daily and how they can change weekly. So yesterday, there were a lot of questions and a lot of issues from public sector clients about, well, what's the status of public meetings? How can we hold them? The executive order that deals with suspending the in-person public meetings requirement expires today, July 6th. And while I have a public meeting that is scheduled for Wednesday or scheduled for Thursday of this week. And so that was much of yesterday afternoon. Well, last night at about 8:45 at night, we got 202.48, which came out and said, okay, look, we're going to extend it again from now, July 7th through July 6th, really, through August 5th for another 30 days. So those, to the extent you're doing telephonic public meetings, certainly video conference public meetings, you can continue those for another month. And maybe that's a little bit of a signal to the things that Hermes was saying and sort of the slowdown. Maybe it's just going to be always the plan through the summer here until we get to the fall. But anyway, that's sort of a breaking news, just came out last night situation for those of you who are required to do your business in a public meeting format, that you now have another month of these video conference meetings. Importantly, the notion of the public meeting should be contrasted from the notion of the public hearing. They're two separate things. There are different reasons why you would need to have one. A meeting might just be to conduct regular business. A hearing might be required by statute. A hearing is intentional to receive the public's input that's required by law. Public hearings are still, at least as of today, as of 12:39 on Tuesday afternoon, that order banning in-person public hearings would expire after today. Will it be extended? My guess is it probably will. If I was a betting man, I'd say look for, Executive Order 202.49 or maybe .50 to come out this evening, certainly by tomorrow morning. That would extend the public hearings ban for another 30 days as well. That will probably go through August 6th. And the language, what you should be looking for is saying, executive order that extends the prior one, Executive Order 202.39, for another 30 days. So I anticipate that will happen based on what happened with public meetings, but we wanted to bring that to you right away because it was sort of important and timely for all of our clients. When I last sort of came on here, we talked about the end being near for the municipal workforce restriction. Well, now the end is here. It's not the end of the phases. It's not the end of safety restrictions, not the end of personal health guidance and obligations. But in terms of the non-essential employees working from home and having that requirement be at least 50% of a municipal workforce, that has now ended. You're authorized to have full complement of your workforce back in a municipal context. Again, this assumes we're not going to have a future setback or change, and if we do, we'll have to monitor that and sort of jump on and address that. The basics were that in Order 202.39, the non-essential were permitted to return 2 weeks after entry to Phase 2. Well, like Hermes showed, mostly everybody's in Phase 4 by now. The Hudson Valley, Westchester does today. Long Island, we lag behind, by a day here, but we'll be in Phase 4 tomorrow. And this sort of accepts out New York City, which has sort of been treated a little bit special the whole way through here based on the cases there. So your municipal workforces should be back to 100% of a complement. But what are some of the issues that we're seeing now in connection with that? People who've been home for 3 or 4 months, non-essential workers who are now understandably, reticent or nervous to return to work. That may be very different than employees who have underlying or pre-existing health conditions who are looking to, have additional either time off or perhaps an accommodation in the workplace or outside of the workplace in the context of remote work to prevent against the COVID-19 impacting their underlying health condition. And so we're getting a lot of notes, a lot of emails, a lot of requests saying, look, I would like to come back to work, maybe. However, I can't. I have diabetes. I have chronic asthma. I have other conditions that prevent me from doing so in a COVID-19 environment. So, one of the things that you need to be doing is engaging in the interactive process with that person, establishing whether the medical documentation is sufficient, looking to see what the nature of that person's position is, what the nature of their duties are. Have they been doing anything up till now? Have they been working from home for the last 3 months? And maybe it makes some sense, but maybe not, right? Maybe they work at the front desk and they take at the tax and water department and they collect checks. Well, that's not something that can be done remotely. So, but they might not be able to. They might not have to work at the front counter. Perhaps they can handle computer records in the back. So I think you have an obligation to really sort of go through that process on an employee by employee basis, to the extent that the medical conditions are being brought in. Another thing that comes up is, well, what happens with the, this federal leave and the extended sort of FMLA leave for COVID-19 when it deals with schools, but the schools are now closed, and really childcare and camp issues. We're dealing with those, and well, look, I was anticipating that my son or daughter's summer camp was going to be open, that they would go there and that would constitute my daycare, so I could work, but now they're closed. We see a lot of that, and we're dealing with those issues. I think the thing that's going to be really one of the biggest is going to be what happens in the fall. For the most part, we had 50% of our workforce in the form of non-essentials home from March through June. And, while kids were home from school, there was a parent there who could watch the children. Well, what happens in the fall if the schools are on some type of, modified opening and closing? What happens if they're 1 week on, 1 week off? What happens if they're 2 days in class and then 3 days at home? We'll have a whole host of non-essential individuals who are now back at work in the municipal context come September saying, hey, look, I didn't need it before, but now I need the childcare leave. And that's something that is going to be, I think, is sort of, over the next mountain here, and it may seem far off, but that's going to be a real challenge as we move forward. And I think you should start anticipating that and thinking about it and getting ready for it. The things that we're doing, we're maintaining our safety for all of our employees, right? We're just continuing. Our village and town halls can be open. The essential workforce has been there. Let's continue those preventative measures. If you have questions and you're concerned about, well, I'm not really sure exactly what I'm supposed to do when I'm opening my village hall or my town hall, and maybe I did it already, but I'm not really confident that I did everything I was supposed to do. That's okay. There's a lot to this. As Suba said, you're trying to take a reasonable approach here and act in a good faith basis. I would suggest, looking at the phase 2 guidance, particularly as it relates to the office work, and seeing if you can pick up some of the safety-based measures there. I would also suggest, and I have to my clients, look, the New York State Safety Plan template, that is, that's a good document to kind of help provide a roadmap for, the things that you should be doing and the things that the state expects you to do in the context of a reopening. The social distancing, the masks, the screening, the signage, print that out, get that template, and look to it. You can use it as perhaps a safety plan, but you can also see the things that you should be doing. And finally, as we've always would say, check out your collective bargaining agreements. Look for ways that you can sort of maximize flexibility with work hours and breaks and the like. To sort of pick up on where Suba and Teresa and all left off earlier, we do have these executive orders relating to travel. They deal with the voluntary travel and the quarantine. One of the things I think is really important is and Hermes said this, you have to have these rules in front of you. And that's why I put in my first bullet point here, for us municipal employers and for those public sector employers, yes, the executive order 205 is important, but it doesn't say a whole heck of a lot. What does say a lot is the June 24th guidance from the New York State Department of Health. And if you go on that page and you'll see lots of embedded hyperlinks and links to prior guidance. And I think the two most important ones for the public sector clients that we really need to address, they were both dated May 31st. They were links inside the June 24th guidance. And I put them right there as bullet points so you can almost copy and paste and plug them in and print them out. It's a little tricky because they are both dated May 31st, so it kind of tends to, you feel like there should be a different date on it. But if you print those two out, it'll tell you two things. One, how to deal with your essential workers who may be accepted out from the quarantine for purposes of coming to work. And two, the second one will tell you who are your essential workers. So yes, we have the 14-day quarantine for our non-essentials, but the question becomes, well, who are the essential employees who don't necessarily need to abide by the 14-day quarantine when it comes to showing up at work? First responders, that's clear. It also says in there that it's any other essential employee who directly interacts with the public while working. Well, who is that? The second guidance, and I put it in the parentheses there, the one that starts updated interim guidance, that document lays out and specifically lists titles and jobs of these types of individuals who are essential employees who directly interact with the public. And many of you in municipalities have these. They're, aside from your police officers who are plainly there as first responders, or your fire or your EMS, they now include your building code enforcement, court personnel, trash and recycling workers, an important piece, utility workers. So look to those documents to help you establish, who is going to be an essential worker for the quarantine purposes. If you are deemed an essential, and many public sector employees may be, you still have to follow certain guidelines upon your return. They were laid out a little bit earlier on in this. I think if somebody has symptoms, that's pretty straightforward, and we have the guidance to deal with that, and I listed it there. But the real issue is, we have these asymptomatic essential employees. Well, what are you supposed to do with them? This consultation with appropriate local and state health authorities. Good luck with that. You're going to leave a message at the local health department. I don't know that you're going to get a lot of interactive dialogue back and forth with the health department about whether, a certain recycling worker is essential or not. I think you rely on the guidance. I think you rely on the documents, and you try in good faith to have that consultation. But otherwise you use that documentation. Those individuals still have to self-monitor. They still have to wear a mask at all times. And they still have to, importantly, quarantine outside of work. And that may be, a significant deterrent to individuals who want to make this, do this kind of travel. One piece that I think is always important is, yes, we have these guidelines, and yes, we have these executive orders, but, look at your business, look at what you do, and determine, maybe we want people to quarantine. It may not be worth it to have the essential or all of our essential employees coming back to work. Is it too much of a health risk? Is it the summertime? Are there individuals who we prefer to have out, so we don't need them at this point in time? Perhaps you can charge leave accruals. Look to work within the context of what your operation is and these rules, because I think that's an important piece to this equation. The final question is, right, well, what do we do with these individuals and perhaps a clerk or somebody who is a quote unquote non-essential employee who voluntarily travels outside New York State and is out there for more than 24 hours and comes back, quickly. Follow the executive orders. Teresa addressed the pay issues. Talk to your attorneys about whether the federal pay issues apply. And, I think that's the real quandary. And I think you really need to get into the speaking with your attorney about that. Those are really just most of the things that are sort of updating on the public sector side, Pete.
Chris, thanks. I sent everyone a message in the chat that we were going to run a little bit over today. Thanks for sticking with us. I want to turn now to Anna Richards. Anna's going to give us an update on the Main Street Lending Program and maybe a few other tidbits. And Anna, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. I'll keep my segment short, but first I wanted to cover a few quick updates on the Paycheck Protection Program. A few days ago on July 3rd, the President signed a bill extending the program for 5 weeks to August 8th, which means that borrowers will have a few more weeks to apply. Also, yesterday, the SBA published information relating to loans greater than $150,000. The precise loan amounts were not disclosed, but the loans are shown in ranges, and the borrower names are included for those loans that are greater than $150,000. And generic information without borrower names was also published for loans under $150,000. If anyone's interested in taking a look, that information is on the SBA's website. I'm going to move on now to the Main Street Lending Program because there have been a couple of new developments there. First, on June 8th, the Federal Reserve announced that There would be an expansion of the program so that more small and medium-sized businesses could take advantage of it. And then more recently, on June 15th, the Federal Reserve announced that the program would be expanded to nonprofit organizations. So before I get into the details of those developments, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the Main Street Lending Program. There's quite a bit of complexity involved in the terms and the structure of the program, so I'm just going to highlight some key features. It was designed to facilitate lending to small and medium businesses that were in stable financial condition prior to the onset of COVID-19, so as to allow them to maintain their operations and payroll until conditions normalize. To be eligible, a business must have fewer than 15,000 employees or no more than $5 billion in 2019 revenue. And these loans are available to businesses that have already received a PPP loan or an economic injury disaster loan. So if a business has already received a PPP loan but requires additional financial support, it could still be eligible as long as it meets the eligibility criteria for the Main Street Lending Program. Borrowers under this program are required to undertake good faith efforts to maintain payroll and retain employees during the time that the loan is outstanding. And this is in light of its capacities, the economic environment, its available resources, and the business need for labor. It's important to note that businesses that have already laid off or furloughed workers due to COVID-19 conditions are still eligible to apply. However, unlike the PPP loans, the Main Street Lending Program loans are full recourse and are not forgivable. Borrowers are also required to demonstrate that they're unable to secure adequate credit accommodations from other banking institutions. And the Federal Reserve has clarified that this does not mean that no credit is available. Rather, it means that the borrower may certify that it is unable to secure adequate credit accommodations because the amount, price, or terms of credit available from other sources are inadequate for the borrower's needs during the unusual circumstances. And the program is operated through 3 facilities: the Main Street New Loan Facility, the Main Street Priority Loan Facility, and the Main Street Expanded Loan Facility. The term sheets for each of these facilities are available on the Federal Reserve website, and they do have some common features. Many of the payment terms are the same. The eligible borrower criteria are the same, and each of the loans could be either secured or unsecured. There are some differences between the facilities as well, including the maximum loan size and restrictions on the borrower's ability to repay existing debt. As far as the mechanics of how the program works, eligible lenders really make the decision as to which borrower applications will be accepted. A borrower applies with an eligible lender, which means a lender that meets the eligibility criteria for the program. The eligible lender then looks at whether the application meets the program's requirements as well as its own underwriting requirements and decides whether to approve the loan. If the loan is approved, the eligible lender then sells a participation to a special purpose vehicle established for the program and funded by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. That's a 95% participation, and the eligible lender retains 5% of the loan. And unless the program is extended, it will go through September 30th of this year. Moving on to the 2 developments that I mentioned earlier. First, the expansion of the program. There have been some changes to the terms of the Main Street Lending Program, which are designed to make the program available to more businesses. The main changes include lowering the minimum loan size to $250,000 from $500,000 for certain loans, increasing the maximum loan size for all facilities, increasing the term of each loan from 5 years, it was 4 years before, extending the repayment period for loans by delaying principal payments for 2 years rather than 1, and raising the Reserve Bank's participation to 95% for all loans. These are the main changes, but certain things will be staying the same, such as the interest rate will remain at LIBOR plus 3% for all loans, and interest payments will still be deferred for 1 year. The second development I mentioned was that there's a proposal that's been made by the Federal Reserve to expand the program to nonprofit organizations. And in making this proposal, the Federal Reserve recognized that nonprofits are critical parts of the economy and that they will also need access to credit during this time. And there are 2 proposed facilities for nonprofits: the Nonprofit Organization New Loan Facility and the Nonprofit Organization Expanded Loan Facility, And the terms of these two facilities really mirror the for-profit facilities for the most part. The minimum loan size is $250,000 and the maximum is $300 million. In order to be eligible, a nonprofit organization needs to be a tax-exempt organization under either 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code or a veterans organization under 501c19 of the Internal Revenue Code. It has to have been established prior to January 1st, 2015, and it has to have been in operation since that time. It must have either 15,000 or fewer employees or 2019 annual revenues of $5 billion or less, and it has to have at least 50 employees. Endowments of less than $3 billion. It has to have 2019 revenues from donations that are less than 30% of total 2019 revenues, and has to meet a number of other financial thresholds relating to operating performance, liquidity, and its ability to repay debt. And just like with the for-profit businesses that are eligible, it has to be organized in the United States with significant operations in the United States and a majority of its employees based in the United States. It cannot have received another loan either under the Main Street Lending Program or the Primary Market Corporate Credit Facility. And it can't have received any specific support pursuant to the CARES Act other than a PPP or EIDL loan. And just like with the for-profit program, the Main Street Lending Program for for-profit businesses, nonprofit organizations will be required to make a number of covenants and certifications. These will include that the eligible borrower must certify that has a reasonable basis to believe that as of the date of the origination of the loan and giving effect to the loan, it has the ability to meet its financial obligations for at least the next 90 days, and it doesn't expect to file for bankruptcy during that period. Also, the borrower has to commit that it will follow the restrictions in the CARES Act that relate to compensation, stock repurchases, and capital distributions. The term sheets for each of the facilities has been published, and those are available on the Federal Reserve website. At this time, the two nonprofit facilities, those are still proposed term sheets, and the comment period for those term sheets ended on June 22nd. We expect that final term sheets will be available soon, and at that time, we'll provide an update. If there are any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks, Pete. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So that we're expecting those developments to occur any day now. Is that correct?
Yeah, it should be in the coming weeks anyway, but we don't know exactly when, but the Federal Reserve indicated that it would be shortly after the 22nd. So any day.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Thank you everyone for staying with us. Sorry we ran a little bit over, but we do try to pack as much as we can into these programs. Thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Stay safe.